Why does he need to go back to this biblical, or really Quranic, we should say, past, and then trace things through the Mongols?
Well, simply because those old Quranic stories tell about the origins of humankind. Where do peoples come from? Really, he's referencing a collection of stories that surround the Quran and travel with it across space and time, called the stories of the prophets. And there's a classic story about Noah, the repeopling of the earth after the flood, which enumerates how one of his sons gives rise to one group of people, another of his sons to another group of people, and the third son to a third group of people. What he's doing with these stories is he's actually describing the peoples of his own period of time and explaining why some are allied to each other and others are in conflict. He traces the conflict between the peoples of the earth back to the time of Noah and like the early stages of the flood, to suggest why it is that Turks like himself, Chinese and Russians have fallen into warfare and conflict of different kinds. And even suggests that, in many ways, he ties that moment of the shattering of the peoples to the problem of translation and interpretation, which was a big issue in his time. In his own time, you had to address power in Chinese, but most people didn't speak Chinese. They spoke their own language, Uyghur, Chaghatay, Turkic. And so these translators, these interpreters, were indispensable for speaking to power. He writes those interpreters back into that ancient history of fragmentation to suggest that it's always been the case that translation makes power manifest in ways that hurt people and draw them apart. So that's very, very important. But he also uses that story to tell about the origins of the Qing itself. We're back to the Qing, suggesting that the Qing Empire is actually a reunification of those ancient peoples. So when the old Qing Empire ruled Xinjiang and respected Muslims and all peoples were at peace, that's because the Qing was able to reunify people and hold them into sort of a stable, peaceful system where they all were able to live by their own rules. But he says, he compares it with his own time after 1877 and says, this is no longer the old Qing. He says at one point, this Qing that's come back, it's like reviving a zombie, reviving a dead creature and finding out that it died of hunger and will destroy you and consume you, right? So there was something good in the past, he says, nostalgically, but there's something really terrible and tyrannical about this new system. And as for the other stories about Genghis Khan and Tughlaq Timur Khan, great rulers who converted to Islam, I think what Sayrami is really doing there is he's selectively telling stories that remind us about how different rulers become Muslim and how the story of his own region fits together. So Sayrami also looks back and he says that there's been no good history written of this region since the 16th century. It's been centuries since there is a proper, orderly history. And so he actually imitates the last history he knows of, the Tarikh-i Ḥamidi, that was well written, and builds upon that narrative. The Tarikh-i Ḥamidi also narrates that ancient history. So in part, he wants to tell a complete history, that's part of it, but also he's putting the Qing Emperor into, I would say, a series of non-Muslim rulers who turn out to be defenders of the faith, and suggesting that we can connect the politics of his own time to those earlier examples of sort of non-Muslims being just towards Muslims.
Right.
But that said, I'll say one more thing on this. We have multiple versions of this story that Sayrami wrote over the course of a decade. And he revised the story of Genghis Khan multiple times. I still need to take a deep dive and see why he was so picky about the Genghis Khan story to figure out what the politics were behind his choices.
Yeah.
Something more is going on there.
Huh.